What would you do if you discovered that the eerie sounds captured on an antique phonograph cylinder could bridge the gap between our world and something far more sinister? Have you ever considered that certain frequencies, certain vibrations, might act as a key to doors better left locked? This is the story of how a small Indiana town in 1909 became the epicenter of a horror that continues to echo through time, waiting for someone just like you to listen. The case began on October 17, 1909, when Sheriff Elijah Montgomery received an urgent call from the recently established Whitfield University in the small town of Millbrook, Indiana. Professor Harold Blackwood, head of the anthropology department, had reportedly suffered some manner of mental break. According to the initial report filed by Deputy James Collins, Blackwood had been found in his office in a catatonic state, surrounded by broken phonograph equipment, with blood streaming from both ears. The university's president, Dr. William Hartwell, attempted to downplay the incident to avoid unwanted publicity for the fledgling institution. In his statement to the local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, he attributed the professor's condition to excessive academic strain and possibly a minor cerebral event. However, what was deliberately omitted from the public record were the contents of Professor Blackwood's journal, seized by Sheriff Montgomery immediately upon his arrival at the scene. "I've studied primitive cultures across 4 continents, documented rituals that would curdle the blood of any God-fearing Christian, but nothing prepared me for what emerged from that cylinder. The chanting isn't human. The language isn't dead. It was never alive to begin with. God help me, I can still hear it even when the phonograph is silent." This excerpt, taken from Blackwood's final journal entry dated October 16th, was sealed by court order on November 1st, 1909, by Judge Franklin Pierce, and only declassified in 1977. The incident might have remained an obscure footnote in Millbrook's history had it not been for the strange events that followed. Within 2 weeks of Professor Blackwood's breakdown, 7 other Millbrook residents reported hearing unearthly chanting even when no music was playing. 5 of them were eventually committed to the Westbrook Asylum in Indianapolis. The other 2 disappeared without a trace, their homes found empty but undisturbed, as though they had simply walked away in the middle of daily activities. The town council, fearing mass hysteria, enacted a temporary ban on phonographs and similar devices, claiming concerns about electrical disturbances affecting the nervous system of sensitive individuals. This proclamation, preserved in the Millbrook Historical Society archives, represents one of the earliest instances of a technology ban motivated by public safety concerns in the state of Indiana. Sheriff Montgomery, however, was not convinced by explanations of mass hysteria or electrical disturbances. His personal diary, discovered in 1953 during renovations to the old sheriff's office, reveals a man increasingly troubled by his investigation. "There's something not right about that cylinder. Blackwood was no madman before he started playing with it. I've locked it in the evidence safe, but sometimes at night I swear I can hear it humming, as if whatever's on it is still trying to be heard. I've written to the boys at Indiana University. Someone there must know what to make of these markings. They don't look like any language I've ever seen." The cylinder in question had been acquired by Professor Blackwood during an archaeological expedition to a remote settlement in Louisiana's Atchafalaya Basin earlier that year. The expedition, funded by Whitfield University to study the remains of an isolated community that had seemingly vanished without explanation in the 1800s, was Blackwood's first major research project since joining the university. According to shipping manifests from the New Orleans Harbor Master's Office, dated June 3, 1909, Blackwood returned with 27 crates of artifacts. All were properly catalogued and displayed in the university's modest museum by July, except for one item listed simply as sound recording device of unknown origin with accompanying cylinder, possibly European manufacture. This item was kept in Blackwood's office for private study. In a letter to his colleague Dr. Thomas Winthrop at Harvard, dated August 12th, Blackwood wrote, "The craftsmanship of the device defies conventional explanation. The materials appear to be ordinary brass and wood, yet the resonance chamber operates on principles I cannot discern. The markings etched into the cylinder's surface bear resemblance to no known script. I've delayed submitting my findings to the journal until I can make sense of the recording itself, which thus far has resisted clear reproduction. There are voices, Thomas, voices speaking in what must be the oldest tongue I've ever encountered. Dr. Winthrop's response, preserved in Harvard's archives, reveals his skepticism. My dear Harold, I urge caution in attributing mystical properties to what is likely a damaged recording. Edison's machines, remarkable as they are, remain imperfect. The human mind, seeking patterns, often imposes meaning on random noise. That said, I would be most interested in examining the artifact myself if you would consider lending it for a fortnight. Blackwood never responded to this letter, as his mental deterioration apparently began shortly after receiving it. According to the university's night watchman, Gilbert Simmons, the professor had taken to working through the night, the sounds of the phonograph occasionally echoing through the otherwise empty halls of the anthropology building. "It wasn't like music you'd want to hear," Simmons stated in his interview with Deputy Collins. "Started like a low hum, then turned to voices, but not speaking any Christian language I ever heard. Made the hair stand up on my neck. Last few nights before they found him, the professor would play the same part over and over. Sometimes I'd hear him trying to repeat the words himself. Last night I heard him speaking along with it perfect-like, which gave me such a chill I didn't finish my rounds. The cylinder itself became the subject of considerable interest following Blackwood's breakdown. Sheriff Montgomery, acting on the advice of Judge Pierce, arranged to have it transported to specialists at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. However, according to telegraph records from the Millbrook Western Union office, the cylinder never arrived at its destination. The official report states that the package was lost in transit, a not uncommon occurrence in the postal system of the time. However, an internal memo from Sheriff Montgomery to Judge Pierce suggests a more troubling development. Package intercepted en route by parties claiming federal authority. No identification provided. Described as two men in dark suits. Railroad agent too intimidated to demand credentials. Recommend discretion in pursuing matter further. By December of 1909, the strange events in Millbrook had largely subsided. Professor Blackwood remained institutionalized at Westbrook Asylum, diagnosed with acute hallucinatory psychosis and degenerative brain function. The university, eager to distance itself from the scandal, promptly hired a replacement and converted Blackwood's office into a storage room after thoroughly disposing of his remaining personal effects. For 18 years, the case of the mysterious phonograph seemed forgotten, until the spring of 1927, when Millbrook once again found itself in the grip of unexplainable phenomena. On April 3rd, a local physician, Dr. Edwin Marsh, was called to the home of Thomas Jenkins, a 57-year-old banker who had reportedly not left his house in 3 days. According to Dr. Marsh's medical log, he found Jenkins sitting in his study, a phonograph playing what he described as discordant, atonal chanting. Jenkins, though conscious, was unresponsive to questions, his gaze fixed on the spinning cylinder. More disturbing was Dr. Marsh's observation, noted in his private correspondence rather than his official report, that Jenkins appeared to be quietly mouthing words in perfect synchronization with the recording. When the doctor attempted to stop the phonograph, Jenkins became violently agitated, suffering what Marsh initially diagnosed as a seizure, but later described to his wife as a transformation I cannot reconcile with medical science. Within the week, 3 more cases emerged with identical circumstances. Individuals found in their homes, entranced by phonographs playing what witnesses universally described as inhuman chanting. In each instance, the affected person had no memory of acquiring the phonograph or the cylinder, yet would become violent when attempts were made to separate them from the devices. The new sheriff, Robert Hayes, less inclined to superstition than his predecessor, initially suspected some form of mass poisoning, possibly from contaminated grain alcohol, given the era of prohibition. This theory was abandoned when chemical analysis performed by the state laboratory in Indianapolis found no toxins in the blood samples provided. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Millicent Blackwood, the niece of the now-deceased Professor Harold Blackwood, had arrived in Millbrook to settle matters related to her uncle's estate. which had remained in legal limbo since his institutionalization. While reviewing his personal papers, which had been stored in the university's archives rather than destroyed as had been claimed, she discovered a series of notes that connected the current incidents to those of 1909. In her statement to Sheriff Hayes, dated April 12, 1927, she revealed a troubling connection. My uncle's notes indicate that the phonograph cylinder he studied was one of 7 created by a cult operating in the Louisiana Bayou in the mid-1800s. They called themselves the Listeners and believed certain sound frequencies could open doorways to what they termed the spaces between worlds. According to local legends, the entire cult vanished during a ritual in 1872, leaving behind only their recording devices. My uncle theorized that the cylinders don't simply play sounds, they replicate them, creating new copies of themselves when played near blank cylinders. This revelation prompted Sheriff Hayes to order the confiscation of all phonograph cylinders in Millbrook, a controversial move that was met with significant resistance from the community. In the process, deputies discovered that many households possessed cylinders, engraved with the same unusual markings as Blackwood's original, though none of the owners could explain how they had acquired them or why they had felt compelled to play them. Most disturbing was the testimony of Eleanor Wright, wife of postal worker Samuel Wright, who had been found in their basement, surrounded by dozens of blank cylinders, systematically recording from one playing the now familiar chanting. "He hasn't been the same since he delivered a package to the university last month," Mrs. Wright told deputies. "Said he heard something calling to him from inside the parcel. Started collecting cylinders after that. Said he needed to help it spread. Called it the great work. I thought it was just one of his odd hobbies until he stopped coming to bed, stopped eating. Just sits down there listening and recording." Listening and recording. The cylinders collected in the raid were secured in the town hall vault, while Sheriff Hayes consulted with experts from Indiana University. Dr. Margaret Phillips, head of the university's newly formed Department of Anthropological Linguistics, arrived on April 15th to examine the artifacts. Her initial report, wired to the sheriff after her return to Bloomington, provides the first scientific assessment of the phenomenon. The language recorded on the cylinders defies classification within any known linguistic family. Preliminary phonological analysis suggests it contains sounds that should be physiologically impossible for human vocal apparatus to produce. More concerning is the psychological effect of prolonged exposure. My assistant complained of headaches and disorientation after just 2 hours of analytical listening. I've secured the samples in our department's specimen vault and recommend against further unprotected study. What neither Dr. Phillips nor Sheriff Hayes could have anticipated was that the vault would be broken into 3 days later, the cylinders stolen, and 2 security guards left dead under circumstances so bizarre that the coroner refused to specify a cause of death, listing it only as acute system failure of unknown origin. The Bloomington Herald's coverage of the break-in was uncharacteristically brief, noting only that university authorities are cooperating with police in the investigation of a burglary at the anthropology building. No mention was made of the stolen artifacts or the deceased guards. However, internal university correspondence, only declassified in 1962 under pressure from the Freedom of Information Act, reveals a coordinated effort to suppress details of the incident. In a telegram to the university president, dated April 19th, the governor of Indiana himself ordered, "Contain situation, stop national security implications, stop federal agents en route, stop no press statements, stop deny phonograph connection, stop." Within days, federal agents arrived in both Millbrook and Bloomington, identifying themselves as representatives of the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI. Their presence was explained to the public as part of a multi-state operation targeting illegal alcohol distribution networks. Under this cover, they systematically located and confiscated every phonograph cylinder in a 50-mile radius, as well as all documentation related to the Blackwood case. Those affected by the chanting sickness, as locals had begun to call it, were removed to an undisclosed federal facility rather than local hospitals. Their families were informed that they were receiving specialized treatment for a rare form of encephalitis and would return when recovered. Historical records indicate that none ever did. By May 1st, 1927, the federal agents had departed. The story had disappeared from local newspapers, and Millbrook had entered into what longtime residents would later call the Great Silence, an unspoken agreement never to discuss the events of that spring. For decades, the case of the Millbrook phonographs remained buried in classified government files, its connection to the original 1909 incident effectively erased from public record. Even the families of those taken away gradually stopped asking questions, as though the very memory of their missing loved ones had been carefully excised from the community's consciousness. The story might have remained permanently suppressed had it not been for the persistence of one man, Howard Jenkins, son of Thomas Jenkins, who had been among those taken by federal agents. Howard, only 12 years old at the time of his father's removal, devoted his adult life to uncovering the truth behind the incidents. In 1956, after years of filing information requests and cultivating contacts within government agencies, Jenkins published a small, privately printed pamphlet titled The Millbrook Frequencies: A Suppressed History. Though widely dismissed as the work of a conspiracy theorist, the pamphlet contained reproductions of documents that would later be verified as authentic when the official files were partially declassified. Most significant was Jenkins' claim that the government had not destroyed the cylinders, as officials had privately assured Millbrook's leadership. Instead, according to a memo Jenkins claimed to have obtained from a sympathetic insider, the artifacts had been transported to a specialized facility in New Mexico for continuous analysis under controlled conditions. The memo, dated June 12, 1927, and attributed to a Dr. W., presumed to be Dr. Elias Warren, who later headed the Office of Scientific Intelligence during World War II, stated, "The acoustic properties of the cylinders represent a breakthrough in non-conventional influence technology. Preliminary testing on volunteer subjects confirms psychological entrainment occurs within 8 to 12 minutes of exposure. Linguistic analysis remains inconclusive, though recurring patterns suggest a coherent communication rather than random phonemic sequences. Recommendation: continue research under Spectrum." Protocol with enhanced containment procedures. Jenkins' pamphlet attracted little attention outside a small circle of fringe researchers and was soon forgotten by most who encountered it. Jenkins himself died in 1967, his life's work largely dismissed as the product of a mind damaged by childhood trauma. Yet in the dusty archives of America's heartland, fragments of evidence remained, waiting to be connected by someone with the persistence to seek them out and the courage to face what they revealed. In 1972, Dr. Rebecca Collins, a young researcher in acoustic physics at MIT, stumbled upon a reference to the Millbrook frequencies in a declassified report on experimental sound-based crowd control technologies developed during the Cold War. Intrigued, she began pulling at the threads of the story, unaware of how deeply it would draw her in. Over the next 3 years, Collins traced a path from the original Blackwood expedition to government experiments that continued well into the 1960s. Her research took her from university archives to the homes of aging Millbrook residents, whose memories of the events had begun to resurface as the effects of whatever had suppressed them weakened with time. Most significantly, Collins tracked down Eleanor Wright, by then living in a nursing home in Indianapolis. Though physically frail, the 93-year-old Wright's mind remained sharp, and she provided Collins with her most valuable lead. "They didn't take all the cylinders," Wright confided in a recorded interview conducted in March 1975. "Samuel made copies, dozens of them, hid them in the walls of our house before they came for him. Said someone would need them someday, that the message had to be preserved. Said it wasn't evil like people thought, just foreign to our understanding. Said it was trying to teach us something important, something about the nature of reality itself." Wright died 3 days after this interview, her death attributed to natural causes given her advanced age. However, Collins noted in her research journal that the attending physician had mentioned unusual cerebral hemorrhaging, not typically associated with ordinary passings. Following Wright's directions, Collins located the former Wright residence, by then occupied by a young family unaware of its history. Under the pretense of conducting historical preservation research, she gained permission to examine the house, eventually discovering a sealed cavity in the basement wall. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well, were 3 phonograph cylinders bearing the distinctive markings described in the Blackwood documents. What Collins did next has been the subject of considerable debate among those few scholars aware of the case. According to her research notes, she initially planned to turn the cylinders over to her colleagues at MIT for analysis under controlled conditions. Yet entries in her personal journal suggest a growing obsession with hearing the recording for herself, alone, before sharing her discovery. The symbols seem to shift when viewed from different angles, she wrote on April 10, 1975. I've spent hours photographing them under various lighting conditions, and I'm certain they're not static engravings. There's a suggestion of movement, as though they're trying to resolve into something just beyond visual perception. I keep thinking about what the Wright woman said, that it wasn't evil, just foreign to our understanding. What if this is genuine communication from somewhere else? Someone has to be the first to listen, with an open, scientific mind, without the government immediately locking it away. On April 12th, Collins recorded her final journal entry. I've modified my home equipment with additional shielding based on my acoustic research. If the frequencies are indeed operating at the neurological level, the modifications should provide adequate protection while still allowing me to document the content. Tomorrow night I listen. Whatever this is, it ends here, either as a footnote to a peculiar case of mass hysteria or as the beginning of something much more significant. Collins was reported missing by her department head on April 15th when she failed to appear for a scheduled lecture. Police found her apartment empty, her research materials meticulously organized, but no sign of the phonograph cylinders she had described in her notes. The only irregularity was a phonograph needle broken in half and what appeared to be deep scratch marks on her living room floor, as though heavy furniture had been dragged across it with considerable force. The case was classified as an unexplained disappearance. Collins' research was collected by university administrators and subsequently disappeared into private archives. For another 30 years, the Millbrook incident once again faded from memory, the connections between its various manifestations obscured by time and deliberate suppression. Then, in the summer of 2005, something unexpected happened. The digital age breathed new life into the forgotten case. An anonymous user on an obscure internet forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena posted a series of digitized audio files claimed to be transfers from wax cylinders found in a deceased relative's effects. The post, titled simply "Listeners," included a brief message: "They've waited long enough. The great work continues." Within 24 hours of the files being uploaded, all 47 users who had reported listening to them complained of severe headaches, auditory hallucinations, and an irresistible compulsion to share the files with others. The forum moderator, alarmed by the reports, deleted the post and the associated files, but not before they had been downloaded and reposted across multiple platforms. A week later, the first YouTube video appeared, a simple black screen with the audio playing at slightly reduced speed. The comments section filled with thousands of identical messages in a script resembling the symbols described in the original Blackwood journals. The video was removed by platform administrators within hours, cited for community guidelines violations, but was repeatedly re-uploaded by different users, some of whom claimed no memory of having done so. The phenomenon caught the attention of Dr. James Martinez, a researcher in digital memetics at Stanford University, who began tracking the spread of what he termed audio infection XMRB1 across social media platforms. His preliminary paper, published in the Journal of Digital Anthropology in 2006, noted disturbing patterns in how the files propagated. Unlike conventional viral media, XMRB1 demonstrates properties more commonly associated with biological vectors, Martinez wrote. Exposure appears to create carriers who are compelled to spread the content through increasingly sophisticated means. More concerning is the observed evolution of the audio itself. Spectral analysis of samples collected over a 6-month period shows subtle but consistent changes, as though the frequencies are adapting to overcome platform TEAS detection algorithms and possibly to increase their psychological impact. Martinez's research into the digital spread of the Millbrook frequencies came to an abrupt halt in February of 2007 when his university access credentials were suddenly revoked. Colleagues reported that he had been placed on indefinite administrative leave, though no official reason was provided. His paper was withdrawn from the journal's archives, with a brief notice citing methodological concerns, and his laboratory was closed, its contents relocated to an undisclosed facility. What few knew was that Martinez's research had attracted attention from the same shadowy government entities that had intervened in 1927. According to documents later leaked by an anonymous source within the Department of Defense, a specialized unit known only as Division 13 had been monitoring the digital resurrection of the Millbrook case from the beginning. "We've contained physical manifestations for 80 years," read an internal memo attributed to the division's director, "but the digitization presents unprecedented challenges. Sound patterns that previously required specialized equipment to reproduce can now be transmitted globally within seconds. Estimate 14,000 exposures already occurred. Traditional containment protocols insufficient." The memo continued with a chilling directive: implement blackout protocol for all identified carriers. Class 3 memory adjustment for peripheral exposures. Priority target remains locating source chamber artifacts referenced in historical files. Belief is strong that digital copies remain degraded from original cylinders. Full manifestation still requires physical resonance matrix. Throughout 2007 and 2008, a series of seemingly unrelated events occurred across the digital landscape. Popular audio hosting sites experienced technical difficulties that resulted in the permanent deletion of thousands of files. Internet forums discussing the Millbrook frequencies or related phenomena suffered mysterious server crashes, their backup data corrupted beyond recovery. Individuals who had been particularly active in sharing information about the case reported bizarre harassment, strange phone calls where no one spoke but a faint rhythmic humming could be heard, emails containing corrupted audio attachments, and in some cases, home break-ins where nothing was taken but personal computers. By 2009, exactly 100 years after the original Blackwood incident, public awareness of the Millbrook frequencies had been effectively suppressed once again. Yet in the background, something continued to spread, more subtle and patient than before, adapting to avoid detection while finding new vectors for transmission. The next documented outbreak occurred in October 2012, when residents of the small town of Clarenville, Nebraska, began reporting a strange audio phenomenon. Everyday devices, cell phones, car radios, digital assistants, even children's toys with sound capabilities, would occasionally emit brief bursts of what witnesses described as rhythmic, chanting in no recognizable language. Local authorities attributed the occurrences to pranksters or technical glitches. But as the incidents increased in frequency, more troubling patterns emerged. Hospital records from Clarenville Regional Medical Center showed a 300% increase in patients reporting auditory hallucinations, severe migraines, and sleep disorders. More alarming were the behavioral changes observed in affected individuals. Previously outgoing residents became withdrawn and secretive, often gathering in small groups late at night in remote locations. School attendance dropped by 40% as children complained of the singing people who visited them in their dreams and taught them new words. What connected Clarenville to Millbrook was not immediately apparent until local historian Edward Simmons discovered that the town had been founded in 1874 by migrants from Indiana, specifically families who had fled Millbrook following the mysterious disappearance of a religious group locally known as the Listeners. They thought they'd left it behind, Simmons noted in an interview with a regional newspaper before his own sudden disappearance 3 days later. But some things don't need physical carriers anymore. They just need the right conditions, the right frequencies in the air. And someone in this town started listening again. By December 2012, Clarenville had been quietly evacuated under the pretense of a chemical spill from a derailed freight train. Official records indicate that residents were temporarily relocated to emergency shelters in neighboring counties, but municipal data shows that fewer than 20% ever returned. The town itself was condemned, key structures demolished, and the entire area designated a watershed protection zone with restricted access. What actually occurred during those final days in Clarenville remains largely unknown to the public. However, a partial report from a hazardous materials team contracted by an unnamed federal agency contains disturbing observations. Numerous electronic devices found emitting synchronized audio patterns despite power disconnection. Unusual symbol patterns observed etched into metallic surfaces throughout affected zone. Multiple recording devices appear to have been constructed by residents using household materials, all oriented towards central gathering point in former community center. Recommend complete electronic containment, followed by controlled burn of all structures. For several years following the Clarenville incident, the phenomenon again went dormant, at least in terms of documented outbreaks. Yet across the internet, those who knew what to look for could detect its continued evolution. Certain audio files shared on obscure platforms contained barely perceptible patterns embedded within otherwise innocuous sounds, ASMR recordings, ambient noise generators, guided meditation tracks. When isolated and analyzed, these patterns matched fragments of the frequencies documented in the original Millbrook case. Dr. Eliza Warner, an audiologist who had briefly worked with Martinez before his disappearance, continued investigating the phenomenon independently. In her private research journal, discovered after her death in 2017, she documented a disturbing hypothesis. The frequencies were not simply spreading, they were learning. Each new iteration shows greater sophistication in how it embeds itself in carrier media, she wrote. The early versions required direct prolonged exposure to the raw frequencies. The next generation could transfer through recordings, but needed specific reproduction equipment. Now it has adapted to digital compression, found ways to survive algorithmic filtering, and developed methods to bypass conscious perception entirely, entering through the background rather than the foreground of awareness. Most disturbing was Warner's final entry, dated just 3 days before she was found dead from an apparent self-inflicted wound. It's not just sound. It never was. The sound is merely the carrier wave for something else, information that restructures neural pathways, creating new patterns of thought, new ways of perceiving reality. I've been tracking changes in my own brain activity for months. Something is being built in there. Synaptic connections forming into structures I don't recognize from any literature. I keep having the same thought. The great work continues. But I don't know what that means or why it fills me with such dread. If anyone finds this, please understand I'm ending this now while I'm still me. Warner's research notes included references to a secured storage facility in Burlington, Vermont, where she believed some of the original Millbrook artifacts might have been relocated in the 1960s. Following her death, an anonymous tip led local authorities to investigate the long-abandoned facility, but they found only empty storage containers and walls covered in the now familiar symbols, apparently carved into the concrete with improvised tools. In 2018, a new development brought the phenomenon into the mainstream consciousness, however briefly. A popular music producer known professionally as Static Void released a track titled Listeners that quickly went viral across streaming platforms. The track featured what the artist described as found audio, integrated into an otherwise conventional electronic dance composition. Within 2 weeks of its release, listeners had reported over 8,000 cases of unusual side effects, ranging from mild auditory hallucinations to intense euphoria to unexplained compulsions. Most notable was the case of Melissa Chen, a 22-year-old student who, after reportedly listening to the track on repeat for several hours, drove 400 miles to a seemingly random location in rural Pennsylvania. When questioned by local police, who found her attempting to access an abandoned mine shaft, Chen claimed she had been called to the resonance chamber and that the great work required additional vessels. The track was quickly removed from streaming services, with the official explanation citing copyright claims over the sampled material. Static Void himself disappeared from public view, though his financial records showed a substantial wire transfer from a shell company later, linked to government contractors specializing in acoustic research. The mainstream media's coverage of the Heise incident was predictably superficial, focusing on the strange internet trend angle while ignoring the more disturbing implications. A few fringe news sites attempted deeper investigations, but found sources suddenly unwilling to speak on record, evidence disappearing from cloud storage, and in some cases, their reporters experiencing the same symptoms reported by listeners of the track. By early 2019, public interest in the story had largely faded, overshadowed by more conventional news cycles. Yet for those still paying attention, signs of the phenomenon's continued spread remained visible just below the surface of everyday life. Reports began emerging from multiple states of individuals discovering antique phonographs and cylinder recordings in unlikely locations, abandoned storage units, sealed attic spaces in newly purchased homes, unmarked packages delivered to random addresses. In each case, the devices were of unusually high quality for their apparent age, bearing no manufacturer's markings, but featuring the distinct symbols associated with the original Millbrook artifacts. Most recipients, unaware of the history, treated these as curiosities. Some attempted to play the cylinders, often with immediate and severe consequences. Hospital records from affected areas show a pattern of patients admitted with symptoms identical to those documented in the 1909 cases: bleeding from the ears, catatonic states interspersed with periods of speaking in unknown languages, and violent resistance to being separated from the devices. What made these cases particularly disturbing was their geographic distribution, which, when mapped, formed a distinct pattern centering on a remote area of southern Louisiana, the same region where Professor Blackwood had conducted his original expedition over a century earlier. In June 2019, Dr. Nathan Reed, a cultural anthropologist specializing in Louisiana folk traditions, ventured into the Atchafalaya Basin to investigate local legends of the Calling Grounds, a site where, according to Bayou communities, people would occasionally vanish after reporting hearing strange music coming from the swamps. Reed's expedition notes, transmitted to his department at Tulane University via satellite phone, documented his journey into increasingly remote areas guided by a local man identified only as Marcel, who claimed his great-grandfather had been the sole survivor of the original cult of Vaux, listeners that had vanished in 1872. Marcel says his ancestor left the group just days before their final ritual, Reed reported. Says they'd found something while digging foundations for their settlement, something metal that sang to them when exposed to air. They built what they called a resonance chamber around it, a structure designed to amplify whatever sounds it produced. According to Marcel's family history, the cult believed they were hearing voices from the spaces between worlds, teaching them how to transcend physical form. Reed's final transmission, received on June 23rd, was notably different in tone from his previous communications. We found the site. Coordinates attached. The chamber is still here, partially submerged but intact. The construction defies conventional explanation. The acoustics are unlike anything I've encountered in my research. Marcel won't go near it, says the singing has already started again. I can't hear anything yet, but there's a strange vibration in the air almost below the threshold of perception. I'm setting up recording equipment now. We'll transmit findings tomorrow. No further communications were received. A search party organized by the university located Reed's camp 2 days later, finding his equipment intact, but no sign of the anthropologist himself. The recording devices contained nothing but static, though university technicians noted unusual patterns in the signal that appeared to have corrupted the digital storage. Most significantly, they discovered a hand-drawn map marking the supposed location of the resonance chamber. However, when search teams attempted to reach the coordinates, they found only undisturbed swampland with no evidence of any structure or human presence, past or present. Marcel, the local guide, had also vanished, his home in a nearby settlement found empty but undisturbed. The university, following what had by now become a familiar pattern, downplayed the disappearance and quickly closed the investigation, citing lack of resources and the dangers of the remote location. Reed's research was archived and access restricted, his position quietly filled by a new faculty member with no interest in Louisiana folk practices. Yet something had been disturbed in the swamps, something that had been waiting, growing, adapting for over a century. Within months of Reed's disappearance, new reports began emerging from communities across Louisiana, electronic devices activating without human input, broadcasting the now familiar chanting. Unusual sound phenomena described as auditory mirages, where voices seem to emanate from empty air. Residents experiencing vivid, shared dreams of a partially submerged structure deep in the swamps, calling them to complete the great work. By January 2020, the phenomenon had spread beyond Louisiana, following patterns that suggested deliberate distribution rather than random diffusion. New outbreaks appeared simultaneously in locations connected to the original Millbrook incident, towns where affected residents had relocated, institutions that had studied the artifacts, storage facilities that had housed them. Most alarming was the evolution in how the frequencies manifested. No longer limited to audio reproduction, they now appeared across multiple sensory modalities, visual patterns that induced the same entrainment effect as the sounds, tactile sensations that triggered auditory hallucinations when touching certain surfaces, even olfactory stimuli that bypassed conscious perception entirely. Dr. Catherine Zhang, a neurologist who had been monitoring these developments through anonymous medical reports, published a heavily censored paper suggesting that the phenomenon had progressed from simple acoustic patterns to a complex, multisensory language capable of rewriting neural pathways at a fundamental level. "What we're observing is not a conventional contagion," she wrote, "but an information system that uses human neurology as both its transmission medium and its evolutionary laboratory. Each new host provides additional processing capacity, allowing the system to refine its methods and expand its reach. The question we should be asking is not how to contain it, but what happens when it achieves sufficient distribution to complete whatever process it has been initiating for over a century." Zhang's paper was published on a Tuesday. By Friday, her university page had been removed, her social media accounts deleted, and colleagues reported that she had taken an unexpected sabbatical to an undisclosed location. Attempts to contact her family were met with confused responses, indicating they had no recollection of her recent work, despite having discussed it with concerned colleagues just days earlier. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, the pattern continued. Brief emergences of the phenomenon followed by swift suppressions, researchers getting close to some central truth before suddenly disappearing or abandoning their work, affected communities experiencing unexplained memory lapses regarding specific events. Then in March 2022, something unprecedented occurred. Rather than isolated outbreaks quickly contained, the phenomenon appeared to achieve a critical mass, manifesting simultaneously across hundreds of locations worldwide. The trigger appeared to be a seemingly innocuous software update pushed to several popular streaming services, which contained embedded code that converted certain audio frequencies in otherwise normal content into patterns matching the Millbrook signatures. For 72 hours, emergency services across the globe were overwhelmed with reports of individuals experiencing identical symptoms: invasive auditory hallucinations, compulsive repetition of unknown phrases, and an irresistible urge to travel towards specific geographic coordinates. Social media platforms were flooded with posts containing the familiar symbols, often from users who claimed no memory of writing them. Most disturbing were the coordinated gatherings that began forming in seemingly random locations: abandoned industrial sites, remote natural formations, defunct communication facilities. Satellite imagery captured thousands of individuals converging on these points, many traveling hundreds of miles by whatever means available, all apparently responding to the same unheard directive. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the manifestation ceased. The affected individuals reported no memory of their actions during the 72-hour window. The coordinated gatherings dispersed, leaving no evidence of their purpose. Digital systems returned to normal function with no trace of the code that had triggered the event. Official explanations ranged from mass hysteria to coordinated hacking attacks to unspecified atmospheric phenomena. International agencies issued reassuring statements that investigations were ongoing, but that no evidence of lasting harm had been identified. Within weeks, mainstream coverage of the incident had faded, replaced by more conventional concerns. Yet for those who knew where to look, something fundamental had changed. The pattern of suppress and contain that had characterized the previous century of the phenomenon had been broken. Whatever force had been slowly working its way into human consciousness since that first cylinder was played in Millbrook had achieved something significant, a global resonance, however brief. In the aftermath, small groups of researchers, many working under pseudonyms and communicating through heavily encrypted channels, began piecing together what they believed had occurred. Their conclusion was disturbing. The 72-hour event hadn't been the culmination of the phenomenon, but a test run, a measurement of how far it had spread and how effectively it could coordinate action across its distributed network of affected minds. What we witnessed wasn't the completion of the great work, wrote an anonymous contributor to a secured document that briefly circulated among these researchers before mysteriously corrupting itself. It was a calibration. The system was testing its reach, identifying weaknesses in its distribution, and preparing for something more permanent. The original cult in 1872 believed they were communicating with entities from beyond conventional reality. What if they were right? What if these frequencies are a technology, an interface designed to reshape human neurology, until it can perceive and interact with something that exists alongside us, but remains just out of phase with our normal sensory capabilities? This theory gained unexpected support in September 2023 when a team of quantum physicists at CERN published a paper documenting unusual patterns in particle behavior during certain sound frequency exposures. Though the paper made no reference to the Millbrook phenomenon, its lead author, Dr. Sofia Nikolaev, included a series of equations that, when plotted visually, formed patterns remarkably similar to the symbols associated with the original phonograph cylinders. 3 weeks after publication, the paper was withdrawn for methodological review. Dr. Nikolaev took an extended leave of absence, and the experimental program was discontinued without explanation. However, before these actions were taken, a graduate student in the program had shared some of the raw data with colleagues at other institutions, allowing the research to continue through unofficial channels. What these scattered researchers discovered was a potential mechanism for how the frequencies operated. Rather than simply affecting neurochemistry, they appeared to temporarily alter how the brain processed quantum information, creating brief moments when human perception could access what theoretical physicists had long described as adjacent probability spaces, essentially parallel realities normally separated from our own by quantum barriers. The frequencies act as a tuning mechanism, explained one researcher in an anonymous interview later transcribed and shared among private groups. They don't just change what you perceive, they change how you perceive, allowing consciousness to temporarily extend into spaces it normally can't access. The problem is, it's not a one-way street. Once that channel is opened, whatever exists in those adjacent spaces can also extend into ours. And from what we can tell, something has been using these frequencies for over a century to gradually construct a more permanent bridge. This revelation coincided with a new pattern of manifestations beginning in early 2024. Unlike previous outbreaks, which had been characterized by their dramatic and often damaging effects on those exposed, these new instances were subtle, almost beneficial in nature. Individuals reported enhanced creativity, unusual problem-solving abilities, and a sense of expanded awareness following exposure to what they typically described as beautiful music or harmonious vibrations that seemed to come from everyday objects. Medical examinations of these individuals showed unique brain activity patterns, new neural pathways forming at an accelerated rate, particularly in regions associated with sensory processing and pattern recognition. More notably, these changes appeared to be stable and non-degenerative, unlike the harmful effects documented in earlier cases.